I was left a relatively wealthy widow, with an income of around £3,000 and various other plate and belongings, but also I had to deal with my late husband's debt. He owed some £50,000, including debts to the Crown, which, in her malice, the Queen demanded payment. She had my estate seized and would not heed any petitions from me. She still held me in such low regard I could do nothing. With a growing sense of desperation, I turned to Robert's master of horse, Sir Christopher Blount, for help. He proved to be such a good friend to me that an attraction grew between us, and less than a year after Robert's death, we were married. He was 12 years my junior, a Catholic, and a younger son of no family fortune, but he'd made his own way in the world and could be trusted to be loyal to me alone. My children were very surprised by my choice, but they had their own lives to lead and were not able to support me as a husband could. He was a great comfort to me when in 1591 I lost my younger son Walter to injury in France. This made me even more anxious for my only surviving boy, Robert. He had risked the Queen's wrath in 1590 by marrying Frances Walsingham, but her anger was temporary and he was soon received back at court. Like his stepfather before him, my Robert became the Queen's champion. Tasked with military roles, taking him abroad in defence of England to Spain, where in 1596 he led an expedition to Cadiz. My husband Christopher joined him, along with my daughter Penelope's husband, Lord Rich. It was a raging success. Ships burnt, towns ravaged and plundered, hostages secured. My Robert was a hero. He returned home in triumph and revelled in the glory. The Queen, however, was less enthralled. She never enjoyed sharing the limelight, and there was not the amount of plunder to fill her coffers as she would have liked. Nevertheless, the following year, Robert and Christopher again set out for Spain. This time, the weather was against them, and in July were forced to return to Plymouth to wait out the gales. But in August, they set out once more. Robert hoped to surpass his victory at Cadiz, but alas, he was unable to reach the Armada. And when he decided to attack the Spanish treasure ships in the Azores, he missed them. He returned to England with nothing to show for his mission, making Elizabeth furious with him. He had failed to destroy Philip's navy and left England vulnerable. Luckily, the Armada had followed Robert back to England and were destroyed by bad weather, thus ending the plots by Philip to conquer England for good. Robert was soon forgiven and returned to court, where he tried his utmost to persuade the Queen to receive me. I had not been to court for nearly 20 years, and when the news came to me that Her Majesty would look kindly upon me, I was delighted. It was winter, though, and the journey to London would be perilous, but I set off to stay with my son and his family to await a summons. In February 1598, I was back at court. Elizabeth had granted me an audience, and full of hope I set off. It was a cruel trick, however. She had decided not to come, and I was left waiting. This happened again, the Queen changing her mind at the last minute, but my Robert would not give up. He begged and cajoled until eventually Elizabeth agreed we would meet. This time, the Queen was there, and I was admitted to the royal presence where I could kiss her hand. But the meeting was very brief. Despite this, I believed it was a first step to reconciliation, but unfortunately it was all a show by Elizabeth to appease Robert. I would never see the Queen again. Devastated, I returned home to my husband in the country and resolved on a quiet life. I still had news of happenings in London from my many friends at court, and soon I began to worry at my son's behaviour with the Queen. He had always been a strong-willed, but this seemed to be growing more severe. My son was still with the Queen, but he was always demanding and speaking his mind, and he wanted much of her, and he'd never really grown out of his spoilt ways. I heard from others that she was growing weary of his outbursts. He demanded war with Spain, but Elizabeth and her council felt war was too costly. He then committed the ultimate discourtesy to Elizabeth when, after an argument over the appointment of a Lord Deputy to Ireland, he turned his back on her. She was furious, and boxed his ears and bid him to be gone. He reached for his sword, but luckily was prevented from doing more, although he compounded this by insulting Elizabeth, saying he would not much put up with this from her father, much less her. When I heard about this, I counselled him to caution, but he was too proud and too stubborn. Eventually, the Queen seemed to have forgiven him and gave him the position of Ireland's Lord Deputy. I was proud he was given such an honour, but could not help but think of his father's death in that country years before. And he failed in his missions miserably by offering a truce to the Irish instead of facing them in battle, wasting all his funds. He was forced to return home in disgrace, where he burst in on the Queen before she was dressed. This was the ultimate insult, and by the end of the day he was confined to his chambers. I was extremely distressed by my beloved son's imprisonment and moved to London to be near him, which incensed the Queen more. I tried to appease her. I sent her a gown worth over £100, money I could ill afford. The Queen refused to accept or decline it, leaving me with no hope. But there was better news, as I was ordered to leave Essex House so that my son could be returned there under house arrest. I was able to visit with him once before I had to return to the country. My beloved boy was eventually granted his freedom, and I hoped he would have learnt his lesson, but this was not to be. He gathered followers to his London house and marched out in open rebellion against the Queen. Worse still, my husband Christopher was with him. I remained in the country waiting for news of my two men anxiously. All was failed. Christopher had been injured. There was nothing I could do. I was impotent in my country house. My son and my husband were arrested, tried, and condemned to death. Robert was only 35 when he was beheaded at the Tower in 1601. I do not know what is worse, to lose a child near birth or childhood, or to lose them when they are a man grown. I now had no living male children, just my two daughters left to me. Worse was to come when 3 weeks later my husband was executed for his part in the rebellion. I was now a widow again, left to my own devices. Only this time I had the stink of traitors in my family. My husband had sold off much of my jewels and land, so I began to fight back in the courts, determined to gain back some of my rights and livings. It gave me something to live for, along with my precious daughters and grandchildren. My son Robert had left a young son, the third Earl, who was restored to his title in 1603 with the accession of the new king, James I. After Elizabeth's death, I spent much of my time with him. James also cancelled many of my debts, for which I owe him greatly. My beloved daughters both died before me in 1607 and 1619. A mother should not outlive her children. But I was still fit and well, walking a mile each day on my estates. Eventually, old age catches up with you. I had outlived 3 husbands, 6 children, and my cousin, Queen Elizabeth. I passed away peacefully in my chair on Christmas morning, 1634, aged 91, a very good age. As per my wishes, I was buried in Warwick with my second husband and with our young son. I shall leave you now, but only tell you of my epitaph. There you may see that face, that hand, which once was the fairest in the land. She that in her younger years matched with 2 great English peers. She that did supply the wars with thunder and the court with stars. She that in her youth had been darling to the maiden queen, till she was content to quit her favour for her favourite.